We've been talking about the war in Iraq throughout this program. I continue to feel this sense, this weird sense of disconnection from reality, not on my part, but on the part of many people around us, and particularly the national conversation that seems to be going on in the media that suggests that we talked about that with Matt Taibbi, but that suggests somehow that nobody could have known that this war was built on lies. But of course, millions of us knew because millions of us protested that war. And here to talk with us more about the anniversary of the war is Jodie Evans, who was very involved in pushing back on it. Jodie is the co-founder and director of Code Pink. She has been involved in movement politics for quite some time. She's the co-editor of two books, Twilight of Empire, Responses to Occupation, and Stop the Next War Now, Effective Responses to Violence and Terrorism. And she joins us now. So first of all, Jodie, thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me, and thank you for talking about this anniversary that we hope people don't forget what we did.
Let's talk about that for a second because, we experienced at the time, I think, the sense that we were being deleted from history as it was being made. I mean, that's the way I felt. Anyway, you had Phil Donahue dared to criticize the war, and he was taken off MSNBC. Reporters who wrote about the fallacy of the presumptions that were used to lead us into war didn't get coverage. Their careers didn't advance. And then when we went out and demonstrated and protested in large numbers, whereas a conservative protest of just a few dozen people might be all over the news, it seemed like we were rendered invisible, but we were out there, weren't we?
Not only were we out there, but what was shocking is that do you know we had to force the New York Times 2 days later to report that we were out there and the numbers we were out there with. What was shocking and what's shocking right now about Venezuela is that the lies get to be the truth. And it was very clear. And to reporters. I mean, when we were in Iraq, they did many stories about what we were finding. We talked to the investigators. We talked to the people of Iraq, and they did many stories, and then they would come to the U.S. and they would die. And later I asked those journalists, like, what were you thinking? You understood this. You knew this. You wanted it covered. And their answer was, I had kids in school. I can't lose my career. But in the meantime, 1 million people are dead, $4 trillion wasted, the Middle East, a disaster. These small moments where these choices are made are what's shocking to me, and that we can make the same mistake over and over again. Right now, Venezuela, the playbook looks exactly the same. People are falling for it in exactly the same way. And I try to understand what happens in people's minds, especially people who are supposed to be journalists.
Well, we're talking about that a lot on this show, and I guess what the journalism is one piece of it, and then there's another piece of it that I think is a kind of psychology in certain circles where people like us who challenge a shared belief, a kind of folk way of a social group, a powerful social group that rules us, are treated as if we're just irritating. It's as if we're not having. I mean, this again, just my perception.
Not just irritating. They try to make it so that you are not credible. I mean, they did that with Scott Ritter over and over again.
Yes.
A very serious person who was rendered, uncredible.
Scott Ritter, who
than anyone that was talking about it.
Right, Scott Ritter, who, for those people who might have forgotten, was I believe an arms control inspector, among other things, certainly knew the military and weaponry dimensions of the argument that was being made and worked to refute them, and was forcefully marginalized. And then we saw, you know, even before the war, when George Bush became president and hundreds of thousands of people came out to protest and were very carefully deleted from the shots of his inaugural motorcade and so on. So you guys at Code Pink, you know, I struggle, since we are fighting some of the same battles today in Venezuela, where the playbook not only looks like the one from 16 years ago, it looks like ones from 50 years ago. You guys at Code Pink came up with a certain set of strategies for breaking through the shadows, the shroud that was wrapped around these stories, the protests, so they wouldn't come out. And I mean, I don't want to speak for you, but basically it seemed to involve getting in on the news. You know, to me, I thought a little bit of, you know, Abby Hoffman at the Wall Street Stock Exchange, for example, but getting in visible places and disrupting. I mean, it seemed to me that that was one of your strategies for getting coverage. Is it fair enough?
Well, yeah, you have to get where the story is and then try to, you know, in a disarming way, debunk it. The first one was behind Rumsfeld with a sign that said, "Let the inspections work." Medea and I, before we even started Code Pink, we rented a boat outside the UN with a giant banner that went across saying, "The world does not want this war, earth to bush, no war in Iraq." Because nobody's going to, you know, you have to kind of disrupt the story as it's happening for people to go, oh, maybe there's something else. And that's been our strategy, you know, since we started. And I want to say that, you know, after we sat down, after we were in Iraq, after the war started, we said to each other, well, we have to stop the next one and try to really analyze what we did wrong and what needed to happen. And I can say in a couple of instances, we've been able to stop acts of war. And really learning like where you have to grab the story before it's a train out of the station. If I look back at September 2002, when we did the first banner and before we'd really even made the call, the Code Pink call, which was Bush administration is frightening the American people into war with terrorist codes word red and yellow. So we called Code Pink for Peace and started our vigil that was every day outside the White House with women from across the world that then went back to their communities and vigiled. Because we knew, especially as women, the cost of war and that there wasn't these stories that they were telling Congress that it was going to cost $6 million and nobody was going to get hurt. So, you know, it was also before the elections that I realized Iraq was going to be forgotten. And Code Pink, we did 2 days, about 100 testifiers, a tribunal on the Iraq War, a day of the lies and a day of the costs, which include the costs of the militarization of our own streets. That if you go back before the Iraq War, many police departments who became soldiers came home. You know, the costs are just enormous. And
well, we talked about that. You know, when we talk about the militarization of our own streets, I guess what you're really talking about, among other things, is the international nature of this struggle and the fact that it includes a lot of countries, many countries, including our own. So I think about not only you know, the soldiers that came back having served in the military and then becoming police officers, but the very conscious program of the Defense Department to take military weaponry and give it to city police forces. I mean, I was involved in a demonstration in Oakland, California, several years ago at the annual conference of police forces, where they get together and talk about how they use the SWAT machinery and the weaponry and the night vision goggles and the big, I forget what they're called, armored vehicles, and use them against their own populations. So, you know, when you talk about mass incarceration, when you talk about the militarization of our police forces, when you talk about the solidarity that was shown during the Ferguson protests, between Palestinian protesters and Ferguson protesters. And when you think about the demonstrations in Madison, Wisconsin, in the Madison Spring, how people in Tahrir Square in Cairo were sending pizza orders, were ordering pizza for the protesters in Madison, Wisconsin. There's an international dimension to this struggle, and I wonder how we keep that in focus too.
Well, I mean, just this last weekend, there was an international outrage against what's happening in Venezuela. I think, the outrage against the Iraq war was global. The last big march, 12 million people were in the streets globally, and we've stayed connected. I think that, the Bush administration and now the Trump administration, in the way they try to bring the coalitions of the willings together, they try to make it international. So we know we are all connected. I just heard from friends in Nepal that the Trump administration came with the carrot and the stick and said, if you don't join with us against Venezuela, that this is going to be the cost. And if you do, here's going to be the goodies that you get. And so I think, like, how many countries are they doing that? And those are countries that know this is horrible for them, no matter where they are.
Right, because if they object, then they're going to be punished in ways that will really hurt them and their people. If they go along with it, they'll be doing something morally questionable. And if there's military action, they'll even lose some of their young people. So I guess, you've mentioned Venezuela a couple times, and rightly so, because that's the latest front in this ongoing war to kind of impose ourselves by force on the world. Where do you see this struggle going next? We've obviously, those of us who are of like mind need to keep up the pressure regarding the Venezuela situation. What do you guys have planned that people should know about and maybe would want to get involved with?
Oh, well, on Venezuela, the Congress members who don't really understand Latin America at all and clearly don't understand, unfortunately, what's happening with the fact that progressive members of Congress would even consider Elliot Abrams instead of the current leadership in Venezuela, or consider, when they were so mad about Russia, taking leadership over in another country. I mean, all that aside, the Washington Office on Latin America is the think tank that members of Congress go to look at what they need to learn about Latin America. And what we are doing right now is we have 10 points on what you can take to your member of Congress and say, no, that's not true. This is what the cost would be. And given that it's the anniversary of the Iraq War, the perfect thing is to take in all the facts about how we were pushed into the Iraq War and the lies that we were given and the facts to refute what really happened. I mean, that you can think that U.S. members of Congress, after how many coups, can think that a coup ends in a good result is shocking.
Right, of course it is, but it's our MO and has been our MO for some time. So unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. But Jodie, before we go, where can people go to find out more about what you guys are doing and maybe stay up to date?
So we're at codepink.org, and if you want to learn more about Venezuela, it's codepink.org/Venezuela.